Thank you very much for coming, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a fantastic crowd. Thanks, everyone. This is really, really great. I love New York. I actually used to live in New York for about 5 years before heading out to Silicon Valley, and so it's great to be back. Today we're going to be talking about habit-forming technology and what makes products so sticky. What I've done over the past several years is to look at how these products that we use every day, how they change our behaviors. And I started looking for patterns, specifically in these companies that tend to meet this specific definition. Maybe you can think of what companies I'm talking about here. These companies that start off as toys, they start off as these nice-to-haves, and then within the blink of an eye, 5 to 10 years, these companies are touching hundreds of millions of people's lives, if not billions of people's lives, and they're making hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars. And so what I've done over the past several years is to try and look for patterns, is to try and understand what's common about these companies that can have such a profound impact on people's day-to-day lives and change users' daily habits. And so when we talk about habits, let's make sure we're all on the same page. What is a habit? A habit, very simply, is a behavior done with little or no conscious thought. It's about half of what you do, day in and day out, whether you like it or not, is done purely out of habit. And so the pattern that I found in writing my book and teaching the class that I teach at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, at the design school there, is called the hook. Now, a hook is this design pattern that we see repeated time and time again in all sorts of products that bring us back, that engage us, that compel us, that make it hard for us to stop looking at our phone so many times a day. We find these hooks. These experiences designed to connect the user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. So a quick word of warning, the book is 250 pages, my course takes about 3 weeks to complete, and I've got about 15 minutes here tonight. So I'm going to condense a lot of information into a little bit of time, but you guys are New Yorkers, you're always in a rush, so you'll get this very quickly, I'm sure. So we're going to go through this fast, but it's a pretty basic model. It's got these 4 basic steps: a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. And it's through successive cycles through these hooks that tastes are changed, that preferences are formed, and that habits take hold. So let's walk through these 4 basic steps. These products start out with a trigger. A trigger is a cue. It's a call to action. It tells the user what to do next. And these triggers come in 2 types, 2 flavors, if you will. We have external triggers, and we have internal triggers. Now, external triggers you'll be very familiar with. These are things in our environment, things that tell us what to do next, where the information for what to do is in the trigger itself. So click here, buy now, play this, a friend telling you about this great new app that you should really try out, all examples of external triggers. So we in the design community, product people, we know all about these external triggers. This is our trade, right? This is what we do for a living, many of us. But what turns out to be absolutely critical to forming these long-term habits with the product we use, and what I think a lot of product people neglect to think about, is the importance of internal triggers. Internal triggers are things that prompt the user to action. They tell the user what to do next, but the information for what to do is not in the trigger itself, as is the case with the external trigger, but instead, the information for what to do next is informed through an association in the user's mind. So what we do in response to being in a certain place, a certain situation, a routine, and most frequently when we experience certain emotions, dictates what we do next, dictates the technology solution we turn to with little or no conscious thought. And it turns out that not just any emotion, but negative emotions are the most frequent internal triggers. So what we do when we're feeling bored or lonesome or indecisive or lost or fearful or fatigued, what we do when we experience these pain points dictate the solution we look for to solve that problem. And some of the evidence that shows this is the case comes to us from a study that found that people suffering from depression check email more. Now think about that for a minute. Why would that be? Why would people suffering from depression check email more? Well, it turns out that what this study found was that people with depression suffer from what's called negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the general population. So what are they doing to boost their mood, to get out of that negative valence state? They're turning to their technologies. They're checking email more frequently than the rest of the population. And let's think about this in our own lives. What website do we turn to when we're feeling lonely? Facebook, of course. And what about when we're feeling uncertain, when we're unsure? Before we scan our brains to see if we know the answer, what do? We Google it, of course. And what about when we're feeling bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you have that big project that you just don't feel like doing right now. What do? We go to YouTube, Reddit, check stock prices, sports scores, check the news, Pinterest. We check all these solutions to this itch, this pain point of boredom. We don't like this feeling of boredom. It's a negative valence state. It feels bad. So what do we do with this information? How do we help people live better, happier, more productive, healthier lives, knowing this information about the importance of internal triggers? How do we build better products? Well, it comes down to fundamentally understanding your user's itch. Not just on a functional level, but if your product is forming a habit, you need to understand the user's itch on a psychological level. It's very hard to scratch the user's itch until you understand really what it is. So that's a very brief introduction to triggers. There's a lot more in the book about triggers as well, but let's move on to the next step of the hook, the action phase. The action phase is the habit itself. It's the behavior. And in fact, it's the simplest behavior that the user does in anticipation of a reward. The simplest thing that we do in anticipation of reward. Let me show you some habit-forming products. And I want you to see how simple these actions are. Something as simple as scrolling on Pinterest, just that act of scrolling. Or searching on Google. Or pushing the play button on YouTube. These extremely simple actions that we do in anticipation of a reward. And it turns out that there is actually a formula for predicting the likelihood of these singular behaviors. It comes to us from a researcher at Stanford by the name of BJ Fogg, who posits that for any human behavior, online, offline, doesn't matter, as represented by B, behavior, we need 3 things. We need sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger. Who's seen this before? Oh, good. Okay, great. So this is new for most of you. This is a really, I think, a useful framework in a product development context. When you're making a product and you're trying to figure out, we've designed this great solution, but people aren't doing it, right? They're not doing the behavior we've designed for them to do. You can ask yourself, do they have these 3 necessary components of every human behavior? Do they have sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger? We talked about triggers. Let's talk about motivation and ability. Motivation is the energy for action. It's how much we want to do a particular behavior. Now, psychologists have been arguing about the nature of motivation for decades and decades, but Fogg gives us these 6 basic levers that we can pull on to increase user motivation. Because all of us as human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain. We seek hope and we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance and we avoid social rejection. So every bit of text on a web page, every advertisement you've ever seen, everything that it tries to induce your motivation level to make you more likely to take a certain behavior uses 1 or more of these 6 levers of motivation. Now here again, there's lots more that we can discuss about motivation, but let's move on to the second part of B equals MAT. The A stands for ability. Ability is the capacity to do a particular action. How easy or difficult something is to do. And here again, we have these 6 factors, these 6 things that we can pull on to make a behavior more likely to occur by changing how much time it requires, how much money something costs, how much physical effort something takes, brain cycles. In our industry, this makes a big difference, right? In technology, it turns out the harder something is to understand, the less likely that behavior is to occur. Social deviance says that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And then finally, non-routine says that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past. And this is why habits are so powerful, because the more we do a given behavior, the easier it becomes, and therefore we become more likely to do it in the future. It's a repeater effect. Right? What do we call that principle? The more I do something, the easier it becomes, the more likely I am to do it in the future. It's called practice. Right? And this is why habits are so important. There's this repeater effect, that things become more likely to occur because the interface is familiar. It's something that I've seen before, and therefore the behavior becomes more likely to occur. So you can take these three factors of motivation, ability, and trigger, and when you're designing a product that for some reason the user is not taking the intended behavior, you can ask yourself, does the user have sufficient motivation? High motivation is at the top on that y-axis. Low motivation is at the bottom. Does the user have sufficient ability? If something is easy to do, it's way over here on your right. If something is hard to do, it's way over there on the left. And if they have sufficient motivation and sufficient ability, they cross that line, that threshold. And if the trigger is present, the behavior occurs every single time. Offline, online, doesn't matter. Let's make this concrete. I want you to think of a time in your life when a phone rang and you didn't pick up the phone. Tell me a reason you didn't pick up the phone. You're busy, right? You were doing, maybe you're listening to me talk right now. Even if the phone rang and you really wanted to pick up the call, high motivation, and you heard it ring, so you heard the trigger, you had low ability. It's too physically difficult to get out of your chair, walk through the aisles. Maybe it's kind of socially deviant to be the guy who has to take a phone call. It's too difficult to do that behavior. What's another reason why you may not pick up the call? You don't know the number, right? So maybe it's a telemarketer, maybe you do know the number, but you just don't feel like picking it up. That would be an example of low motivation. So even if the phone is right there next to you, and you heard it ring, so you could have picked it up, high ability, if you lacked motivation, you don't cross the threshold, no behavior occurs. What's one more reason that has to do with the trigger, why you may not pick up a phone? You didn't hear it. You didn't hear it. It's on silent, right? So think about this. Even if you had high motivation, you really wanted to pick up the call, even if the phone was right there next to you, very easy to pick it up. If you didn't hear it ring, if no trigger was present, the behavior does not occur. I can't tell you how many times I consult for the companies I work for, and they lay out the entire flow. I can see the entire user experience in front of me, and I ask them, and I ask myself, what do you want the user to do here? Where's the trigger? So don't be one of those companies. For any human behavior, we need all three of these things: motivation, ability, and a trigger every single time. Next, let's talk about rewards. After we figured out the user's itch, the simplest behavior in anticipation of reward, now it's time for the reward itself. This is where the user gets what they came for. But when we talk about rewards, we have to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which was first studied by two Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner, who discovered that this part of the brain had some very peculiar properties, namely that when they implanted electrodes in the brains of these lab animals, and they gave them a little lever to press on, that they could self-stimulate this part of the brain. They could send a tiny electrical current to this part of the brain whenever they wanted. They did so incessantly. They would click time and time again. They would forgo food and water. They would run across painful electrified grids just to continue to activate this part of the brain with a tiny electrical current. In later experiments conducted on people, we exhibited similar tendencies. That when people were given the ability to self-stimulate this part of the brain, they did so hundreds of times. Many of these people had to have the machines forcibly removed from them to get them to stop stimulating the nucleus accumbens. Well, it turns out that we don't need electrodes to activate our nucleus accumbens, because all sorts of things activate your nucleus accumbens every single day. Luxury goods, sex, junk food, chemicals, and of course, technology. All of these things activate this very same part of your brains every single day. Now, Olds and Milner and much of the psychology community believe the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to stimulate pleasure. Right? Why else would lab animals and later people incessantly activate this part of the brain if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Not exactly. It turns out that the role of this part of the brain and the way the brain gets us to act is not by stimulating pleasure per se, but the stress of desire. Because it turns out what we now know about the nucleus accumbens that Olds and Miller did not know is that the nucleus accumbens becomes most active in anticipation of a reward. But when we actually get the thing we want, the thing that's going to make us feel good, the thing that's finally going to make us happy, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So it turns out that the role of this part of the brain is to create this itch, this wanting, this craving, this desire response. And it turns out that there is a way to supercharge this stress of desire. Does anybody want to know how? Anybody curious? I'm doing it to you right now. So by taking that long pause and by asking you a question with a question mark in the end and piquing your curiosity, some of you kind of perked up. What's he going to say next? What's he going to do? And it turns out that in all sorts of things that we find most habit-forming, most engaging, the things that capture our attention and won't let go, you will find this element of mystery, this bit of variability, which of course comes from the classic work of B.F. Skinner. Many of you might remember Skinner from your Psych 101 class, the father of operant conditioning. Right? Skinner took these pigeons, he put them in a little box, he gave them a disc to press on, and every time the pigeon would peck at this little disc, at first, they would receive a food pellet. They would receive a reward. And so what Skinner basically did was train these pigeons to peck at this disc whenever they were hungry. But then Skinner did something a little bit different. He introduced a variable reward. So sometimes the pigeons would click on the lever, but nothing would happen. The next time the pigeon would click on the lever, the reward would come out. A little food pellet would come out. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times the pigeons clicked on the lever, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. Why does this happen? Because what we now know is that variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens. It arouses this desire response, this itch, this craving response. And in all sorts of products that you probably use every single day, the ones that you find most habit-forming, the ones that engage us and won't let go of our attention, you will find one or more of these variable reward types. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. So let's talk about these briefly. Rewards of, whoops. Sorry. Huh. Well, that was variable. That's never happened before. So we're missing a couple of slides, but let me just talk through them. So rewards of the tribe are things that feel good, that come from other people, and have this element of mystery, this element of variability. So if you think about empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good, cooperation, competition, all examples of rewards of the tribe. Best example I can think of online is social media. Think of Facebook, for example. When I use a site like Facebook, you're never quite sure what you're going to find. What photos did people post? How many likes did something get? What are the comments going to say? High degree of variability about what you might find when you open a product like Facebook and check your newsfeed. Rewards of the hunt stems from our primal search for resources, right? For food and other resources. And so when many people think of variable rewards, they think of slot machines. They think of gambling, where the variable reward in a slot machine is the currency, right? It's the money that comes out of the machine. That's exciting. That's variable. You're never sure what you're going to win. And it turns out that we see a very similar mechanic in information rewards. So think about the feed for a minute. Why is it that so many products today, why does every technology product today have this feed? You ever notice how popular that's become over the past 5, 10 years? Well, why is that? Let's think about it. Think about your Twitter feed for a minute. As you're scrolling through your Twitter feed, you might see one thing that's not very interesting, another thing that's not very interesting. Oh, but maybe that third thing is interesting. And so what do you have to do to get more of these rewards? What do you have to do? You keep scrolling, right? So this scroll is very similar to pulling on a slot machine. This searching and never done searching for these variable rewards of the hunt, these information rewards. Finally is rewards of the self. Rewards of the self are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about these information or material rewards. These are things that feel good in and of themselves. These are intrinsic motivators. So the search for mastery, consistency, control, competency, all of these things are intrinsically motivating. Great example might be gameplay, right? If you're playing Candy Crush, you're not really winning anything, right? You're not winning any big prizes. It's all in the game. You're not even playing with any other people. But there's this search for mastery, control, competency that people find very enjoyable. And I know what some of you are thinking, well, but I'm not a gamer, right? That doesn't work on me at all. I bet you play one game every day, and that is your email inbox. So that need to check those unread messages so that you can get them out of the way, so that you can master them. Or when you see an app notification with that little jewel icon that says, check me so that you can clear me away. Or your to-do list that's constantly populated with new things to do. All examples of rewards of the self, the search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. So the purpose of the variable reward phase, the reason that so many successful products have these built in, is because what the variable reward phase is for is to give the user what they came for, to scratch the user's itch, and yet leave them wanting more. And there's a fundamental connection between the internal trigger, the user's itch, and the variable reward. So if the internal trigger is boredom, well then the variable reward damn well better entertain. If the internal trigger is loneliness, seeking connection, well then the variable reward has to connect people together. Okay, it's all about giving the user what they want, and yet having this bit of mystery around what you're going to find the next time you engage with that product. Which brings me to the last step of the hook, the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product in anticipation of a future benefit. It's not about immediate gratification. This is for a future reward. The point of the investment phase and why they're so important, why they're so critical in habit-forming products, is that they increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. And they do this in two ways. Number one, investments load the next trigger. Let me show you what I mean by loading the next trigger. When I use an app like WhatsApp, and this has been in my slide deck way before the $22 billion acquisition, when I use an app like WhatsApp and I send someone a message, there's no immediate gratification. I don't get points. I don't get badges. Nothing really happens when I send someone a message. What I'm doing by using this platform, by investing in this platform, by sending a message, is that I'm loading the next trigger because I'm likely to get one of these. A notification telling me that someone has replied. And what is that big red jewel icon there? It's an external trigger bringing me back through the process once again, bringing me back through the hook. The second way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by storing value. You know, one of the reasons I love working in technology products is because unlike products in the physical world, right, things made out of atoms, these things depreciate with wear and tear. Right? So the more you use your laptops, your phones, these chairs, tables, everything in the physical world depreciates the more you use them. But habit-forming products and habit-forming technologies should do the opposite. Habit-forming technologies should appreciate with use. They should get better the more we use them. For example, the more content I put into iTunes, the better the product becomes as my one and only music library. The more data I give to Mint.com, a personal finance software, or Pinterest, for example, the more data I give those sites, the better the product becomes for me. It literally changes to my needs, so that if you were to log into my Pinterest account, it actually wouldn't be that interesting for you, because it's been tailored with my data to be better for me. Next is followers. So followers is a form of stored value that makes a product like Twitter better. So the more followers I have on Twitter, the better that tool is as a way for me to reach my audience. So if Twitter sent out an email tomorrow and said, sorry, Twitter's no longer free, we're going to start charging you for it, who's more likely to send a check? Someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers because they've stored all this value in the product the more they use it. And then finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. Because on platforms like TaskRabbit and eBay and Airbnb, My reputation score dictates how much I can charge for my goods and services. And how likely am I to leave one of those platforms after I've spent all that time accruing this good reputation? Right? Kind of unlikely, kind of hard to do to leave. So that's it. The 4 basic steps of the hook: a trigger, action, reward, and investment. And it's through successive cycles through these hooks that user preferences are changed, attitudes are tweaked, and habits are formed, that habits take hold. So as I warned you, that was a lot of information. I'm sorry I didn't have more time to go into more detail. There's a lot more information in the book and on my blog. My blog is called nirandfar.com, and you can learn more about the book at hookmodel.com. But let me leave you with what I think is the most important slide. That if you're building a product that you need to turn into a habit, if your business model requires forming a habit, and by the way, not every business model needs a habit. Plenty of ways to bring users back. But if you're working on a product that, like the companies I mentioned earlier, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest and WhatsApp, these companies depend upon unprompted user engagement. They rely upon users coming back on their own. And if Facebook had to, or any of these companies had to pay an ad to bring users back every time, it wouldn't work, right? The business models would fall apart. So if that's the kind of business you're working on, if that's the kind of product you're working on, you have to ask yourself these 5 fundamental questions to see if you meet the archetype for these habit-forming products. Number 1, what's the itch? What's the internal trigger that your product is addressing? Number 2, what's the external trigger that brings your user to take the key action? Number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, number 5, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook in the future? So that's it. But before I go, there's one more thing I want to talk about. And that is the morality of manipulation. That many of you, while I was giving this presentation, were probably kind of shifting in your seats and asking yourself, you know, is this kosher? Like, is this okay to do to people, to use their hidden psychology to manipulate their behavior? And if you had that reaction, bravo. I think that's a good human response to this information. Because let's face it, the products we're building, if you're changing user behavior to meet your ends in mind, that is a form of manipulation. And so we have to be very careful with this power. Because the products that we're building, these are the products that people take with them to bed every night. It's the first thing they reach for in the morning before they even say hello to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogost said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So we have a very special responsibility as product designers, as innovators, as entrepreneurs, as engineers. We have a very special responsibility to understand how we will use the psychology of habit design for good. And so what I encourage you to do with this information is to pick one of the world's problems, is to engage people in something meaningful and something important, and to use the psychology of habit design to help people live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives, and to borrow from the words of Gandhi, to build the change you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much. Do I have time for questions? Do I have time for questions? Or you want to do 2 questions? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
great.
we have time for 2 questions from the crowd. So does anyone have a question for me?
Let me do that. While I'm taking these 2 questions, I've got a request for you here. Can everybody raise their phones? Raise your phones for me. All right. I've made the ability really easy. I've increased your ability to take this little survey for me so that I can know how I did on the presentation. I'm constantly tweaking it. Would love to know what you thought of it. Just 5 quick radio buttons, really big radio buttons, take you about 30 seconds. As soon as you click submit on the bottom of that little 5-question survey, you'll be taken to my SlideShare page. You'll be given a link to my SlideShare page where you can get all the slides you just saw, share them, keep them, do whatever you like with them. And with that, I'd be happy to take a couple questions.
We got a couple over here.
Yeah, go for it.
So just start with your name and where you work.
I am Sal. I founded a news aggregation company called Minor, M-I-N-R.me. My question was, you spoke about social responsibility. Facebook doesn't seem to give a fuck. Just like, do you agree, disagree? You know, we know they were doing experiments.
Yeah.
It seems like the whole world is a labyrinth. Mark Zuckerberg on his earnings call spoke about how he wants to monetize everything, including WhatsApp, which always was not about monetization. So just
Yeah.
thoughts about social responsibility in regards specifically to Facebook, et cetera.
Sure. So I obviously care a great deal about the morality of manipulation. There's a whole chapter in the book about it. And I give a two-part test. Because the question is no longer, can we hook people? I think that's kind of a moot point now. We know that the technologies have gotten to a point where they're so compelling, they're so good, that we know that hooking people and creating these habits is possible. The question is, should we? And so I give a two-part test, for not to judge other people, but for entrepreneurs, for innovators, for product designers to ask themselves, what's worth spending my human capital on? And that two-part test is, number one, am I building something that I believe materially improves people's lives? And only you can answer that question, right? Can you look yourself in the mirror and say, yes, I believe that what I'm working on materially improves people's lives? And number two, do I use the product? Do I use the product? Now, why that second condition? What's the first rule of drug dealing? The first rule of drug dealing is never get high on your own supply. And so I'm making people building potentially habit-forming products use it on themselves first, break that first rule of drug dealing so that if there are any negative effects, you'll be the first to know about it. So if you can follow that rule of not only building something that you actually believe in your heart materially improves people's lives, and you yourself are the user, not only do I think that's a good moral place to be, it turns out that's the archetype for the founders of all the companies I just mentioned, including Facebook. These were people who are what I call facilitators. Now, you can make a good business without those criteria. I give this little matrix of, yes, no, do you believe it materially improves people's lives? And yes, no, do you actually use the product? There's businesses to be had in all four buckets. But where I think your highest odds of success, as well as being on a good moral footing, is to be that facilitator, is to build something that you believe materially improves people's lives, and it's something you use. And it turns out that, I don't want to go back to an age before these products, right? I love Facebook, I love Twitter, these technologies have enhanced my life. Do some people go overboard with these products? Absolutely. But for the vast majority of people, these products are perhaps bad habits at times, right, that we need to dial back. And so I'm an advocate for breaking hooks as much as I am for building them. That I believe that until we understand how these products make us come back time and time again, what's the deeper psychology behind why they work so well, until we understand that, it's going to be difficult to put technology in its place. So to make sure that we control our habits as opposed to our habits controlling us, it's critical that we understand this deeper psychology.
Thank you. Second? Yeah, right here.
My name is Ivan,
Hi.
and I can say the comics library of icons for user interface designers. And I've read your book, and it made me think a lot about our product. And from what I remember, the most examples are about some entertainment software and entertainment products.
Right.
Where do you think is the line? And if you know some examples of professional tools, professional software and services that all of us may use in our professional life?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So I use a lot of, most of the book is around products that have very, very big audiences, right? Because it's easier to talk about Facebook, a product that's used by 1 in 8 people on the face of the earth, than it is, talking about a lesser known enterprise software. But any product that seeks to form a habit follows the same exact model. So the differentiation isn't enterprise versus consumer web. The differentiation is, do you need a habit or do you not need a habit? Because again, lots of products don't need habits, and that's fine. So reading the book, you're going to take some bits and pieces of consumer psychology, but you don't need the whole thing. But if your business model requires a habit, you need all 4 steps. You can't form a habit without these 4 steps. And there's plenty of examples in the enterprise space, particularly these enterprise companies that started from the ground up, that started from frontline employees using the product, forming habits with the product, and then percolating the buying decision up into the organization. So I'm talking about GitHub and Salesforce and Stack Overflow and Slack. They just raised at $1 billion valuation, this company Slack, because they have an amazing hook. And so we see in all sorts of enterprise products that are adopted from the frontline employee, same rules apply, the same 4 steps apply. Anything that requires unprompted user engagement, people doing these behaviors with little or no conscious thought, same 4 steps apply. And with that, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.